They didn't walk away because they felt nothing. They disappeared because they felt too intensely and couldn't tolerate what it exposed within them. The silence you are trying to decode is not empty at all. It carries weight, filled with something most people never directly witness: the heavy presence of shame. If this is beginning to resonate, if you are starting to recognize a deeper pattern behind that silence, take a moment to sit with it. Because what becomes clear here can shift not only how you view them, but also how you understand yourself. Avoidance may suppress emotions, but suppression never eliminates impact. It only stores it. What looks like calm emotional distance on the surface is rarely the absence of feeling. It is more often a controlled exterior placed over something active, unresolved, and still moving underneath, often rooted in early experiences or repeated relational patterns. They come to learn that expressing emotion can lead to discomfort, conflict, or a loss of control. So they adjust by minimizing what they feel, pushing emotions down before they fully form, convincing themselves that detachment equals strength. Yet emotions do not vanish simply because they are ignored. They settle into the mind and body, quietly accumulating over time. When they hurt someone, that stored emotional weight does not disappear with the moment. It lingers, often growing heavier because it is not processed directly. Instead of openly acknowledging guilt, sadness, or regret, they compress those feelings further inward. This builds internal pressure. The mind may try to rationalize what happened to reduce emotional intensity, but the deeper layer remains untouched. That is why their responses can seem delayed, inconsistent, or confusing. Outwardly, nothing is shown, yet internally, something is still unfolding. Suppression also fragments their awareness. On a surface level, they may understand they caused pain, but they struggle to fully experience the emotional reality in a way that leads to repair. Truly feeling it would require vulnerability, and vulnerability threatens the protective structure they depend on. So they distance themselves not only from the person they hurt, but also from the emotional experience itself. Over time, this pattern reinforces itself. Each suppressed emotion adds to an internal backlog that becomes increasingly difficult to face. The more they avoid, the more overwhelming the eventual confrontation feels. This is why silence often follows emotional conflict. It is not emptiness, but accumulation, not indifference, but unprocessed intensity contained without release. After hurting someone, they do not simply move forward as it may appear externally. Internally, there is a tension between two opposing forces that rarely resolve. On one side sits awareness, sometimes faint, sometimes sharp, that they caused harm. This awareness can carry guilt and recognition that their actions disrupted something meaningful. On the other side is a deeply rooted instinct to avoid emotional discomfort at all costs. These forces do not cooperate, they clash. Guilt rises in subtle waves, appearing as brief memories or flashes of reinterpreted moments. But before it can fully develop into reflection, the protective system activates. The mind quickly shifts to reduce intensity, justifying actions, minimizing significance, or redirecting attention. This is not deliberate avoidance, but automatic self-protection shaped over time. Both sides feel necessary to them. Guilt pulls toward accountability and emotional truth, while protection warns that staying there risks exposure, instability, or identity collapse. Vulnerability does not feel like simple discomfort. It feels destabilizing. So even when part of them recognizes harm, another part forces retreat. This creates internal inconsistency. They may feel deeply one moment and appear unaffected the next. They may consider reaching out, then immediately withdraw. From the outside, it can look like coldness, but internally it is a looping conflict that never fully resolves because it is never fully faced, only managed through distance. Shame, not indifference, often sits at the core of their silence, though it is rarely visible from the outside. Indifference is empty and weightless. Shame is dense and consuming. It does not just acknowledge an action, it reshapes it into identity. When they hurt someone, the experience expands from "I did something wrong" into something far more personal. Instead of "I handled that poorly," the internal narrative shifts into "This is who I am." That shift changes everything. If the issue is behavior, it can be corrected or repaired. But if it feels like identity, exposure becomes threatening. Remaining present after causing harm would mean sitting in a state they already struggle to tolerate within themselves. This is where silence forms, not as manipulation, but as protection from further emotional exposure. Shame compresses their emotional range, making clarity and expression harder to access. Words feel risky or inadequate. Any explanation feels like it could deepen inadequacy or confirm feared perceptions. At the same time, the connection does not disappear. It remains, now intertwined with discomfort. Reaching out would mean re-entering a space where shame might resurface or intensify. So they withdraw, not because nothing is felt, but because what is felt is too entangled to navigate safely. From the outside, this can look like emotional detachment or indifference. Internally, it often reflects the opposite. It is withdrawal caused by difficulty reconciling actions with identity, leaving them suspended between awareness and avoidance, present in thought, but absent in expression. Emotional closeness activates a quieter but powerful fear within them, not because connection is unwanted, but because of what it begins to reveal. At a distance, interactions feel manageable. They can engage and appear open as long as emotional boundaries remain intact. But as intimacy increases, those boundaries begin to dissolve. The connection becomes more personal, and with it comes exposure they are not fully prepared for. Closeness invites visibility of parts they can manage and parts they have long avoided. Insecurities, inconsistencies, unmet emotional needs. This creates internal tension. On one hand, they may genuinely want connection to grow. On the other, discomfort rises as they feel increasingly seen. For someone who relies on control and emotional containment for stability, this visibility can feel threatening. The fear is often not fully conscious. It may appear as hesitation, withdrawal, or sudden emotional shifts. They might begin questioning the connection not because something is wrong externally, but because emotional intensity is rising. That intensity carries the possibility of judgment or inadequacy. As this feeling grows, they begin to pull back, not always through direct communication, but through subtle distancing, reduced availability, or emotional withdrawal. This retreat is not necessarily about the other person. It is an attempt to restore internal control. In doing so, the closeness they were moving toward becomes the trigger for stepping away. The connection reveals more than they feel ready to face, and rather than remain in that exposure, they return to distance as a form of safety, even if it weakens something meaningful. Withdrawal becomes a way to avoid self-confrontation, not because awareness is absent, but because staying would require emotional honesty they cannot sustain. When tension rises after they have caused harm, there is often a brief moment of clarity. They sense the impact, the disconnection, and their role in it, but instead of remaining there, they instinctively retreat. Self-confrontation demands stillness. It requires sitting with discomfort, allowing emotions to exist without immediate escape, and facing internal contradictions, wanting closeness while resisting it, caring while causing harm, needing connection while fearing it. For someone who has built safety through distance, This feels overwhelming. It is not only about admitting fault, it is about facing conflicting parts of the self simultaneously. Withdrawal interrupts that process. Distance reduces emotional intensity. It lowers immediate discomfort, but it also prevents integration. So the tension does not resolve. It simply becomes quieter, stored again rather than processed, continuing the cycle beneath the surface. The reminders gradually become less immediate, and the emotional signals lose their sharp edge. This creates the impression of relief, as if the problem itself has lessened, but in reality it has only been delayed. The underlying conflict remains fully intact, simply pushed out of direct awareness. This pattern often becomes reinforced over time. Each episode of withdrawal strengthens the association between distance and safety. It conditions them to believe that discomfort can be avoided by stepping away instead of being worked through. As a result, withdrawal shifts from being a choice into something closer to reflex. Even when part of them understands that staying present and addressing the situation could lead to resolution, the impulse to avoid is stronger. What makes this dynamic difficult to perceive from the outside is that withdrawal can resemble detachment or emotional disinterest. Internally, however, it is often a reaction to emotional overload. They are not stepping away because nothing is felt. They are stepping away because too much is felt at once, and they do not know how to hold it without losing internal stability. They may replay moments in private while showing little to no outward sign of regret, creating a visible gap between their internal experience and external expression. After an interaction ends, especially one charged with emotion or harm, their mind does not simply disengage, it circles back repeatedly. Conversations reappear in fragments. Certain words stand out more than others. Reactions are re-evaluated in hindsight. These internal replays are not always intentional. They tend to surface in quieter moments when distraction fades and reflection becomes unavoidable. Within these mental reviews, perception subtly shifts. What seemed insignificant at the time may begin to carry more emotional weight. They may notice tones they previously dismissed, responses that now feel sharper than intended, or missed opportunities where a different response could have altered the outcome. This process can bring them closer to recognizing regret, but it remains largely internal and contained. The difficulty arises in translating recognition into expression. Communicating regret requires more than understanding what went wrong. It demands vulnerability, the willingness to expose that awareness to another person and accept whatever response follows. For someone who relies on emotional distance as a stabilizing mechanism, this step feels inherently risky. It introduces the possibility of judgment, rejection, or deeper emotional entanglement, outcomes they are conditioned to avoid. As a result, reflection remains internal. They may develop clearer understanding over time and even experience genuine remorse, but it is rarely expressed outwardly. This creates a silent form of processing where insight can grow, but relational repair does not occur. From the outside, it may appear as though nothing has been acknowledged, as if the experience left no emotional imprint. This disconnect between internal processing and external behavior can also generate frustration within them. There are moments when the urge to reach out briefly emerges, when awareness feels strong enough to act upon, but hesitation follows quickly. As time passes, silence becomes harder to break, reinforcing the habit of internal containment rather than external expression. Silence functions simultaneously as a defense mechanism and a form of self-directed consequence, operating in two directions at once. On the surface, it acts as protection. By not responding, not engaging, and not reopening contact, they create distance from emotional intensity tied to the situation. This reduces immediate discomfort and restores a sense of control over their internal state. In this sense, silence serves as a stabilizing barrier when emotions feel too intense or fragmented to process directly. Yet the same silence also produces a less visible effect. It does not resolve the emotional experience. Instead, it leaves everything suspended. The connection remains incomplete, the emotions unexpressed, and the understanding unfinished. Because of this, the experience does not fully settle. It lingers beneath awareness, returning in thoughts, subtle reminders, or moments of unintended reflection. Silence begins to function not only as protection, but also as containment without resolution. In the absence of dialogue, they are left alone with their interpretation of events. Without external feedback or relational clarification, internal narratives remain unchallenged. This isolation can intensify emotional processing. Whatever is felt, regret, confusion, discomfort, has no outward channel of release. It remains contained, circulating internally without resolution. Over time, this can create a persistent undercurrent of tension, not always obvious or dramatic, but steady and unresolved. This is how silence gradually becomes a form of self-imposed consequence. While it protects them from immediate emotional exposure, it also prevents closure. The discomfort they avoid externally is replaced by a quieter, longer-lasting internal strain. The absence of resolution becomes its own form of weight. From an outside perspective, silence may appear like an easy escape, but internally it often preserves the very tension it was meant to avoid. It shields in the short term, but binds in the long term to an unresolved emotional loop that continues beneath awareness. Meaningful change begins only when internal discomfort is faced rather than bypassed. Avoidance can delay emotional confrontation, but it cannot eliminate what has already been formed internally. In avoidant patterns, the mind becomes increasingly skilled at escaping emotional intensity through distance, rationalization, or silence. These strategies provide temporary relief, but they also block integration. What is not directly faced does not disappear. Instead, it accumulates and subtly shapes future behavior across relationships and experiences. Inner discomfort is not solely emotional pain. It is also awareness. It is the moment where contradiction becomes visible, where what is felt and what is expressed no longer align. When this discomfort is avoided, the gap between internal experience and external behavior expands. Protective responses become default reactions. Withdrawal in closeness, silence in accountability, distance in emotional depth. Over time, these responses begin to feel like identity rather than learned patterns. When discomfort is allowed to remain present, even briefly, a different process begins to emerge. Instead of immediate escape, there is observation, not intellectual analysis meant to neutralize feeling, but simple recognition of its presence. In that space, emotional intensity begins to shift. What once felt overwhelming slowly becomes more understandable, and what becomes understandable loses some of its threat. The discomfort does not disappear entirely. Instead, its role changes. It shifts from something that must be escaped into something that can be held without immediate reaction. Within that holding, integration begins. Actions and emotions begin to reconnect. Consequences become linked with intent. Experience starts to form coherence rather than fragmentation. Without this process, cycles repeat. Withdrawal follows closeness, silence follows emotional impact. Internal conflict continues without resolution. But with even small moments of staying present rather than fleeing, interruption becomes possible. Each interruption weakens the automatic nature of avoidance and gradually creates space for different responses, where connection is not instantly interpreted as danger and responsibility is not automatically translated into escape.